Hello everyone, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from a Hometown Scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. Join the cities. Hello there. Have you ever wondered why the three cities of Grays Harbor are not one? I'll bet there isn't a resident on the harbor who hasn't at one time or another conjugated on the subject of uniting Aberdeen, Hoquiam, and Cosmopolis. It's not a recent idea. In fact, it's an idea that is so old and has been talked over so much that most people who think it's a good idea have long since given up it as a hopeless proposition. Just when the residents of the harbor started out to join the cities, I can't make certain. But they were talking about joining Cosmopolis with Aberdeen back in 1903. And there was more talk about uniting Hoquiam and Aberdeen about 1912. And there was a real sideshow in 1928, and before and since there have been attempts to do something about it. But as we find out tonight in our scrapbook, there's a lot of inertia to move, and the best-meaning people with the best ideas have thrown up the sponge when it comes to fighting the old tide of prejudice and small-town opinion. And in spite of the efforts and ideas of the time that have gone into it, after nearly half a century of trying, the three city governments now administrated the affairs of less than 35,000 people, and what might be the pretty far-sized city with a say in the state activities is split three ways into a Class A town and two Class B cities. Now, there are of course many sides to the old subject, and it's made a lot of good history. So tonight we'll open the scrapbook to the page to tell us of the many maneuvers and manipulations to bring the three towns together as one. First though, here's Dick Crombie and a word from our sponsor. Now when Sam Ben and his engineer David Fleet laid out the town of Aberdeen, it was just about halfway between the settlement that rural Nims was promoting on the south bank of the Chehalis River called Cosmopolis, and the cluster of wooden shacks that crowded down the Hoquiam River near George Emerson's sawmill and had a post office called Hoquiam. Cosmopolis was a good row up the river from anyone who had business with the neighboring community, and Hoquiam was a piece across the swamp and over the hill if you took the trail. It probably never occurred to the promoters of any of the towns that they might someday be rubbing elbows. But as communities grew and Aberdeen added the south side development and the west end, and Hoquiam's addition reached out to touch the one and Cosmopolis the other, real estate men and engineers who studied maps noticed that the cities were really just about like one. And more than one of those old-time promoters got excited about the possibility of bringing the towns together under one administration to make one large, fine city. And one time, it could have been the fourth city of the state had the towns united. Well, back in 1903, the spark first caught fire, and it had to do with Grays Harbor Commercial Company. That whip-cracking organization that ran Cosmopolis was the town's principal industry and was law to residents of the little hamlet. It seems that the commercial company was having growing pains, and it had announced that it wanted railroad additions in Cosmopolis to be vacated for the mill's company use. Now, that was a little high-handed, and a few of the Cosmopolitans looked at it that way, and it was just about the last straw for them. And at the local council meeting, a few of them had the gumption to get up and sound off about the commercial company's pressure methods. It took a lot of nerve because almost everyone who worked in that little town worked for the commercial company, and most of the businessmen were dependent on the big mill management for their favor. But a few of them had their share of enough. And they said that since they were being pushed around, maybe it was time to hook Cosmopolis onto Aberdeen anyhow. And the next day, a committee of Cosmopolis men met with a group of Aberdonians in the office of Frank Jones. It was the 9th of November, 1903. They said that everyone in town, except the mill company, was in favor of joining Aberdeen. They said that the mill company opposed the growth of the town and wanted to make it a mill town. The Cosmopolis people agreed to give land to Aberdeen for a city park to help get the streetcar line and the bridge across the Chehalis. And the Aberdeen folks did a little pencil work and discovered that Aberdeen would be boosted to more than 10,000 in population, which would make it a city of the second class if it took on Cosmopolis. It sounded good. But before the Aberdeen City Council could act on the request of the Cosmopolis businessmen, the mill company started its work, and there was another meeting in the office of Frank Jones. This time, the Cosmopolis delegation was composed of Neil Cooney, superintendent of the big mill, Stanley Smith, the county commissioner who had worked back by the mill, A.G. Wellington, who operated the express company and a meat market and who was friendly with the mill, Oscar Havelson, who worked as foreman in the mill's box factory, John Pulver, Bill Birdwell, a clerk at the mill, Al Luke and C.E. Seaman, employees of the mill, and W.F. Patterson, the editor of the town's paper. They claimed that no one wanted the consolidation except a committee of malcontents. And the Aberdeen's committee, composed of Ed Ben, John Hogan, Frank Jones, Al Stockwell, Hal Crawford, editor of Aberdeen's daily paper, and A.G. Anderson, was thrown back on its heels. The two stories didn't make sense, but the Aberdeen committee could see that the internal squabble was going to have to be settled before anything could be done to bring about a ballot on the issue. And they withdrew from the whole thing to wait to see what happened in Cosmopolis. And the issue was settled over there. It was settled that the mill company would continue to control the town, and the issue of joining with Aberdeen never came to a vote. And so ended the 1903 debate on union of the city. In 1908, the ministers of the harbor started something when they formed the Greyport Union of Churches. 8 churches in the 3 cities joined the group, which was aimed at the first step in bringing the towns under one government, with the name Greyport. It was hoped that the cities might accept the name Greyport, but hope withered on the vine. And then in the 1920s, right now, right here, it might well be good to say a word about the phenomenon that blossomed in the 1920s, is today an institution in Grays Harbor. In fact, it's an institution in which the harbor takes some considerable pride. We mean the Active Club. You see, the Active Club is different from most of the eating organizations in that it was founded right here in Aberdeen. The first meeting of any Active Club took place in a loft of Carmen's sweet shop, where the spar beeps indoors open on Heron Street. And after Aberdeen got its Active Club, Hoquiam had one too. And a young fellow who formed the clubs were as active as their name implied. This was a real group of doers. Carl Morak was one of the moving spirits of the organization, and Earl Woodland, Carl Springer, and a lot of others who are enjoying middle age today had energy to burn back in 1928, and they challenged some of it into a project to join the cities of the harbor. The activists looked around at the 3 towns operating with 3 administrations, keeping 3 sets of school districts, 3 fire departments, 3 police forces, and at least 2.5, and at all of the other duplications, and asked why it should be so. Then they set about to bring them all together. They dug into the argument that had been thrown up against the union of the cities. There was the old wheeze that no one from Aberdeen would vote for consolidation if it meant that the city would be called Hoquiam, or no one from Hoquiam if it would be called Aberdeen. And those were not bad arguments because they were pretty well founded in fact. Then there was the opposition of the rival factions in the two cities, people who had been out of jobs if the administrations were consolidated. So the active club boys decided to start it in small ways. First, they selected a name for the new city and tried to bring Cosmopolis in with Aberdeen as the first move. This was agreed on as a good first step. Now, selecting a new name for the city was a Herculean job in itself. If you stopped 10 people on the street and asked them what the town should be called, they would probably tell you they had no idea, and let them think about it for a while. And you'd get just as many answers from the people when they finally had time to think. That's what happened. There was Greyport, Greyville, Grays Harbor City, Greyton, Greyburg, and Grey City. There were such possibilities as Washingtonius, Westview, West Haven, West Harbor. Chehalis City was suggested, and the list went on indefinitely with many variations on the theme. Now the active club were only 30 or 35 Aberdonian men, but they had trouble agreeing on a name between themselves. And when they had finally eliminated the unacceptable variations, they arrived. What do you think? Just Grays Harbor. Not Grays Harbor City, just plain, unadorned Grays Harbor. And about the 1st of October 1928, the young men of the Active Club started their campaign to bring Cosmopolis into the fold and to change Aberdeen's name to Grays Harbor. It started with a debate before the High 12 Club, a fraternal eating club, with Carl Morak taking the affirmative and J.W. Clark, editor of Grays Harbor Post, taking the negative. The Activians presented the Aberdeen City Council with a petition calling for a ballot on the name. The newspapers were spread with space denouncing the idea on one hand and supporting it on the other. However, it became apparent early in the race that the brunt of their work fell on the Active Club. People in Aberdeen said, sure, all three towns should be one good city, but, and then came a string of opposing thoughts. One half page was filled with quotations from people and civic leaders. W.L. Brackenridge of the Central Labor Council said no. Senator Edward C. Finch said if Hoquiam would go along, all right. George J. Wolfe said, change the name and it'll cause confusion. Joe Graham, president of the Pioneer Association, said, what? Change the name of Aberdeen? Never! Sam Ben and his son, Ed, 5th Ward Councilman Grover Boyle, all opposed it. The Activians shouted again, 547 new voters, and take the first steps for consolidation of all the three cities. On November 3rd, the city voted. It was 2-1 against the measure, and thus died the only attempt to consolidate the three cities that ever got before the public for a vote. Oh, there's more to it. But first, here's a few words from Dick Crombie and our sponsor. People opposed the change because Grays Harbor City had come to an evil end, and they didn't want the stigma of the name. So they said, whatever it was, the Active Club tried to stir up another move to consolidate the three cities, but to no avail. And finally, they dropped the whole thing. And there have been talk of consolidation since, but no concerted action. And still, the nearly 35,000 population of the cities on Grays Harbor show up on the map as 1 Class A and 2 Class B cities. Still, people come to the harbor and wonder why it's not one city, which most folks agree it ought to be. That's why we look for it tonight as a page in our Hometown Scrapbook. Thanks for listening.